A man went to his primary care physician. It was time for his annual wellness visit. He had been in the waiting room. The nurse called him to the back, and the first thing she asked him to do was to step on the scales. And so the man stepped on the scales, and he sucked his stomach in, and he said, 160 pounds. The nurse looked at the scales, and she said, I'm sorry, sir, but you weigh 166. She said, now let's see how tall you are. So he stood up straight, and as she is preparing the device, he said, 5'10". The nurse looked at the numbers, and she said, I'm sorry, sir, but you're 5'9". Then she asked him, she said, sir, what is your normal blood pressure? He said, normal? Regular? You think that I'm going to have a normal blood pressure today? I came in here a tall, slender man, and you've already made me into a short, fat man. How do you think that I'm going to have a normal blood pressure? Now, I love that story because it reminds me of every annual visit that I make to my doctor for a wellness visit. I have the perfect weight for a 6-foot-tall man. And I'm not 6 foot tall. In fact, some people have described me as a short man, which makes me have a special place in my heart for our story tonight. Tonight we're looking at the story of Zacchaeus. We're going to look at his story and to see how Jesus impacted his life. One of the things that I love about reading through the Gospels is of how Jesus looked out for those who had been overlooked. We'll talk about that with Zacchaeus tonight. But I think about the adulterous woman in John chapter 8. The woman that society was just ready to throw her out. They didn't care about her. She was an outcast. They were using her as a way just to get to Jesus. But Jesus refused to overlook her. The blind man in John chapter 9, remember the religious leaders kicked him out of the synagogue, and Jesus right after that went and searched out. He looked for that man to encourage him. I think that's great. I think about the sinful woman in Luke chapter 7. It's where people are looking at her and they're saying, man, if he just knew who that was, he wouldn't have anything to do with her. But Jesus would not overlook that woman. And in the same way in our story tonight, Jesus would not overlook Zacchaeus. It's a great story. One of the things I think about is when we get to a story that is so familiar to us, like the story of Zacchaeus. Sometimes we're tempted just to skim through that. But I want us to stop, read through the story afresh. And I believe that God will have something in store for us to glean something new. Maybe it's a reminder, but maybe it's a new lesson for us. And so let's read the story together, and then we can talk about it. Luke chapter 19, begin reading in verse 1. Scripture says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and they began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. That's Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. I've told you in previous lessons that when I'm just engaging in Bible study, I like to just ask questions. And that helps me. Sometimes there are answers, sometimes there's not. But one of the questions I have in this story, it's only recorded in the Gospel of Luke. It makes me wonder, how did Luke get this story? We know from Luke chapter 1 that Luke made careful investigation, put together an orderly accounts of these events, and prepared those for Theophilus. It's a great study for us in the gospel, the life, the ministry of Jesus. But how did he get this story? Did he talk to one of the disciples? One of the disciples might have remembered it. Is it possible that Luke talked to Zacchaeus? I don't know. Again, there's no answer to that question, but I just find the question interesting. So let's get started. What do we know? Well, we know that Jesus was in town. Jesus was in town, he's in Jericho, and he's coming through town, and a lot of people wanted to see him. But there was a man there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. All right, so what do we know about Zacchaeus? Well, Zacchaeus was not well liked. And you can try to ride around that all you want to, but Zacchaeus was not well liked for two primary reasons. First of all, he would have been seen by the Jewish people as a traitor because he worked for the Roman government in collecting taxes for the Romans. Man, he's taking money from the Jewish nation and then handing it over to the Romans. Well, he's handing over some of it. That brings up the second idea, is that he was a thief. Man, tax collectors were thieves. They pocketed any extra money. And so what do we know about Zacchaeus? He was a chief tax collector and he was wealthy. What does that tell us? It tells us he was good at his job. But the people looked at him as a traitor and as a thief. But they would have also seen him as ceremonially unclean because he was in regular contact with Gentiles. As a result of that, Zacchaeus would not have been able to offer sacrifices or to worship at the temple. And so where would that leave him? Well, it would leave him separated from Jewish people, and it would leave him separated, alienated from God. Now, I can see this thing building into this cycle where Zacchaeus has collected taxes, the people get upset at him, and so he says, you know what? I'll raise their taxes. So he raises their taxes the next time, so they get even madder at him. And so their hatred of Zacchaeus continued to grow. So it shouldn't surprise us at all that here Zacchaeus was, and he is a short fella, and he's trying to get to see Jesus, and nobody was wanting to help him out because they knew who he was. They knew what he did, and they didn't want anything to do with him because he was a traitor, he was a thief, and he was ceremonially unclean. And so Zacchaeus was on his own. So he had to climb that sycamore fig tree in order to be able to see Jesus. But Jesus would not overlook Zacchaeus. Chapter 19, verse 5 reminds us when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and he said to him, Zacchaeus, I must have you come down immediately? I must stay at your house today? Wow. I just have to ask you, think about the reaction. Think about the reaction, first of all, of Zacchaeus. Man, he just wanted to see Jesus. He wanted to see who he was. And Jesus looked at him and said, Zacchaeus, I need you to come down from that tree because I want to go to your house and I want to be with you today. Zacchaeus had to have been jaw-dropped. And likely the crowd was as well. Why would the crowd have been jaw-dropped? Well, all the people saw this. They began to mutter. He has gone to be the guest of a sinner. Now, I find that very interesting. You know what they did there? Do you know what the crowd did there? they were able to criticize Jesus and Zacchaeus in one statement. He's gone to be the guest of a sinner. First of all, Zacchaeus is a sinner, and now look at the crowd that Jesus has chosen to be around. Okay. Do you remember our current series? It's entitled 11 because it's built around this idea of having a group of friends, a circle of friends, friends that we all need. And I'm going to tell you this, that when we think about having a Nathan in our life, that person who loves us enough to tell us the truth, to help us be better, the crowd would have no problem with having a friend like Nathan. When we think about Jonathan, this true friend, and the crowd wouldn't have had a problem with having a friend like John, that good friend. You think about a Jethro, the wise man who is constantly speaking wise words. Now, would the crowd have had a problem with a person like that? I don't think so. But boy, when we get to Zacchaeus, this guy that is a chief tax collector, he's wealthy, he is a traitor, he is a thief, and he is ceremonially unclean. They had a problem with that. And so they criticized Jesus and Zacchaeus in one statement. He has gone to be the guest of a sinner. The crowd criticized Jesus and Zacchaeus in one sentence. That's not the only time in Scripture this happens. Matthew chapter 9, verse 10 and 11. This is when Jesus called Matthew to follow him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, I find it interesting in the story of Zacchaeus, they just said he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. In this story, and we'll see this in one other in just a moment, it's like we have this separate category for tax collectors. Man, you're not just a sinner, you're a tax collector. That's how people looked at tax collectors in the day of Jesus. Luke chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Boy, I can just hear how that would sound in the church today. Because I have to tell you, these are religious leaders that are making comments like that. So we shouldn't be surprised to find out the good church folk might have that same type reaction when a sinner comes to worship. Now go figure what we have here in Luke chapter 15. We saw it in Matthew, but we see it especially here in Luke. Do you remember why the tax collectors and sinners were there? They were there to hear Jesus. Friends, sometimes we get so caught up in who someone has been, what their reputation has been, what they might have actually done, that we forget, you know what? Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. And in order to save the lost, He had to seek them, which means that He had to go and to be with them. And so Jesus spent time with tax collectors and with sinners. And so maybe there's a lesson there for us. Leonard Sweet, in his book 11, he talks about the importance that as the church, that we should live out the gospel. He says, in fact, one of the struggles that he has with the church is that we have become content to live in the gospel. In other words, we keep the gospel sheltered within the four walls of the building or within the circling of the wagon of Christians. But we live in the gospel. We are called to live out the gospel. Let me give you examples of what I mean. We are called to love, and that we live in the gospel and we live out the gospel. That means we love people in the church. That means we love family, we love friends. But we need to have a love for the lost. And so I ask you, do we have a love for the lost? where it would motivate us and challenge us to want to share the message of Jesus with other people, perhaps even people with questionable past and maybe even current reputations. We need to be a people that when we serve in, we're living in the gospel, we're also living out the gospel. That means that we serve people in the church and we serve people outside the church. That's what I think about when I'm thinking about these neighbors of ours to the south in Louisiana and then all the way up the coast that have suffered such devastation in Hurricane Ida. And I think about where meals will be served by churches of Christ, by Christians, and by some of our organizations that we support to help in those efforts. Supplies that will be donated and be handed out. You know, one of the things that we don't do is we don't ask where you go to church, of whether you get the supplies or not, or whether you get the meal or not. We might use that to open up a door as an opportunity for evangelism, but we want to serve you regardless of who you are. And I think that is wonderful. What a wonderful display of Christian love and Christian service. We also need to be a people who live in compassion, but also live out compassion. That means that we feel for the hurting, whether that's people within our church family that are hurting, or whether it's friends in the community, people that may not be Christians that are hurting. We have to learn, church. We must grow in our desire to love the lost, to serve the lost, to show compassion to the lost, and to develop relationships with the lost. Now, hear me out. It's one thing to live in the world, to do the things of the world, to talk like the world, to act like the world. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that we let our light shine in the world. That we want to develop relationships with people where they know, they can tell there's something different about us. Man, I hope that we can do that, because that's when, and I've already heard stories this past week. This has been so encouraging to me. I've heard so many stories of people within our congregation that are inviting our neighbors to come and to worship with us. May God bless us in those efforts. And I pray that there will be fruit that will grow into a great harvest as a result of the seeds that are being planted even this past week. We want to share the gospel. We want to live out the gospel in our love, our service, compassion, and in the relationships we develop with the lost. Okay, so here Zacchaeus is, and the people have looked at him. They've been muttering about him. Oh, look, Jesus has gone to be the guest of a sinner. There's something about this interaction with Jesus that impacted Zacchaeus, that changed him. Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Now, what we know is this. We know that if Zacchaeus had stolen money, that he would be required to pay back that plus something extra. But Zacchaeus went so far and beyond that. Jeff Stride, as a minister, he makes this observation. Zacchaeus was suddenly struck by the poverty of his soul, by the shabbiness of his life of selfishness and pettiness. Jesus, the Son of God, ate at the home of a sinful and self-centered man, and it impacted Zacchaeus. It changed him. It rocked his world in a very good way. Now, Zacchaeus would have been required to repay the amount plus 20%. However, what did Zacchaeus say? He started off by saying, "I'm going to give away half of my money to those that are suffering in poverty. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'm paying back 4 times the amount." A lot of people look at that and say, well, maybe Zacchaeus was an honest tax collector. I'm going to tell you this. He wouldn't have been wealthy and he wouldn't have been cheap tax collector if he had been that honest. I just don't think so. I think what Zacchaeus did is he came in contact with Jesus, and I think it changed him. I think it changed the way that he looked at other people. I think it changed the way that he looked at his life. I think it changed the way that he looked at his future. Man, what a great statement of what Zacchaeus did. So let's leave. I've got just a couple of lessons that I'd like to share with you. It's really one from Zacchaeus and one from Jesus. First of all, the lesson from Zacchaeus is that I want to be reminded, and I want to remind us tonight, that people are hurting. There are people in our society, there are people in our community that may even be in a position of influence, but they're hurting. You know, people are hurting, people are being overlooked, people are being labeled as outcasts in our society, and people are hurting. And as Christians, can I plead with us, please? Don't overlook those who are hurting. Let's make it our goal to reach out to them, to impact them in a positive way for Jesus Christ. People are hurting. Let's don't overlook them. And then, what do we learn from Jesus? I find this interesting. Jesus is the one that was born, and his first manger was, his first bed was a feeding trough, a manger, because they didn't have room for him in the inn. There was a time when there was someone that was wanting to follow Jesus, and he said, now you need to understand that the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Jesus was even buried in a borrowed tomb. But this same Jesus is the one who said in John chapter 14, he said, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I'll come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. Jesus is preparing a home for us. He has a place for us. If we are faithful to the Lord, if we come to Jesus, confessing Him as Lord, believing in Him, being baptized for the forgiveness of our sins, then Jesus has a room for us. Perhaps our need tonight is to renew, to rededicate ourselves to the service of the Lord. Then know this, that Jesus has room for us. Jesus had room for all kinds of people. The ones, a lot that society had overlooked. Even people like Zacchaeus, that chief tax collector, was wealthy, but who was looked at as a traitor, a thief, and ceremonial unclean. But look how Jesus described him as we close our time together. Jesus said to him in Luke 19, verse 9, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. He always looked for the ones that the rest of society had overlooked. He shared the gospel wherever he went. And I encourage us to do the same. Look for those who were hurting, that may be overlooked by society, and make sure that we take opportunity to share the gospel message with them.